Well, hello everybody. I'm delighted to be introducing Glamorgan into the hearth tax discussion. I'm going to start with a little description of the county because many of you may not know what's going on where. So I start here with a map which shows the 400-foot contour. So you can see that the county really divides into two parts. You've got the high upland, which is the Blina, and the lower ground, which is the Brow. Now this shows a map with the Gower on the extreme western side, which before 1543 was not part of Glamorgan. We were all under 12 Marcher lordships who chose their own law, and they chose their own borough rules. But after 1543, they put the whole Glamorgan and Gower all into one county, and we came under English law. Now, the upland county mainly was suitable for horses, cattle and sheep, and there was some iron and copper smelting. And the lowlands were more engaged in general farming, cereal, grass, hay and stock. But with all that coastline, there was a lot going on between Glamorgan and Somerset. And of course, it was the main route up to Bristol, which was then the second largest port. Now, it's very much a county of stone and castles. Castles, because of course, before we were united with England, there was quite a lot of fighting going on between the Anglo-Norman lords and the Welsh princes. Now, if I go on to the next slide, coming up to 1670, this is only an approximate map of the population density per parish in acres per entry. And you will see that it corresponds roughly with the previous map, with the uplands having very few people, and the most densely populated places are around the ports, Swansea and Cardiff and Aberavon and Neath, because the river was navigable up that far. Now, if I go on to hearth tax returns, there are two surviving ones for Glamorgan. And as Catherine said, you need to look at all the lists there are. But the work that I've done on the earlier list shows that it's very, very different from the 1670 list, which is the one that's been used for most of the research. Now, Coity, which was a parish, 20 hearths in 1660, but in 1670, they were only mentioned 2 hearths alongside it. And then we come to an eastern hamlet nearly in Monmouthshire, Squire Thomas of Rupert. Note that's an English sort of name, 24 hearths. And then it's 48 in 70. Well, in fact, he didn't build it that fast. It was just that they've got lost in the different list because the 1660s list has far too many not chargeable hearths. And when we get to Cardiff, of course, all the main towns had castles, and Philip, Earl of Carbery, who was the Lord President, pulled it down. Now that is referred to in the 1670 list, but the 14 hearths would have been still there before, but they're not mentioned in that list. Now, if we now go on to what the list actually looks like. Now, this is an extract from the 1670 list, and it starts with a 30 hearth entry for the Lady Mary Stradling. And if you go down, you can see a vicar, somebody, yes, Jonathan Nichols Clark for 4. And a bit further on, we have Mr. Richard Nicholson with 5 hearths. Apart from the very high hearthed one, it looks a bit like an English village list. It has a number of not chargeable, but you must remember that the Glamorgan list shows very few not chargeable. So until I get access to all the surviving exemption certificates, you know, you can't really do deep research. And there is, of course, another problem with Welsh lists, which is the names. Now, those of you familiar with Wales will know that Pris ap Einan means priest son of Einan. There aren't too many of these actually in the tax list, except up in the Welsh uplands. But then you have names like Lewis David John. Well, I've just assumed that that's one person, Lewis up David up John, but you can never be sure. And then if you're working out statistics for the county and you're working out households, how do you interpret these? You have Elizabeth Rosser and tenants or tenements, 4 hearths. Now, it's very definitely an ampersand there. So this presumably means that Elizabeth has some and the tenants have others. So you have to divide that figure. Now, when you come to Edward William for Henry David, that's a different proposition, because Edward William looks as if he's paying for Henry David. So you know that that's one entry. And then what you do with John David John Pritchard, well, I've just left him as 1. Now to go on to the houses. Since this is a conference on vernacular architecture, I concentrate on the lower hearthed entries. And the next one will show a gable, fairly common gable entry, 1/2 house, and it's alongside the fireplace. And of course, they're all built of, a lot of these are built of stone, so they're still surviving in the Vale now. Now I'm going to take you with a few other 1/2 houses looking rather different. This one came from a house in Llanguinness parish, which is right on the extreme tip of the Gower Peninsula. The Gower farming was much more conservative than the rest of the country. Enclosure took longer to implement, and the acreages were much smaller. Probably the farms only had about 15 to 20 acres. I can't identify this in the hearth tax, but since 60% of the chargeable entries were 1 hearth, the chances are it probably is this. Now, it looks a bit sanitized now because, interestingly, it was the first cottage to be moved to the Museum of Welsh Life in St Fagans. And if you're interested in housing and you ever have a chance to go there, it's well worth seeing. Now, the story of this house, it's built in about 1610, a gable entry hall house with 1 room on the ground floor here and 1 above, approached with a wooden ladder. About 1680, a large kitchen was added along this side and 2 doors, 1 there and 1 on the other side, and they changed the roof ladder to some stairs. Then in 1750, they added this bit at right angles to the main building with an upper room probably used for storage. And you can see that the windows all look all at different levels. Now the barn was brought in much later, but you can see that originally it would have been at a different level. The red colour of the walls is supposed to protect against evil spirits, and they also used to plant rowan trees in the garden to do the same thing. Now, a very different 1/2 house coming up now from the upland parishes. Now, this is Outersleck in Llangyfelech, which is not far from Neath, and you will see these 5 words here for plans to be made. Now, that's to remind me that the examiner who went round, or the archaeologist looking at the house in 1970, wrote a little sentence which said, Mrs. Gavion is very house proud and is very happy for plans to be made. So she obviously loved her little house. You wonder why it's like this. And if you look in the hearth tax lists, at this stage, it all changes. You have as many not chargeable as chargeable, and all of them, 80% of all the entries were 1/2. And this is because there was coal mining. And the coal lay upon the top of the open common land. So you had a long straggling settlement of colliers' dwellings set within gardens and enclosed from the common. They think that the workforce may have built them because there's no evidence of squatter housing. Now, it was built, if you see, the ground is slightly higher here. Well, in fact, it's what they call a platform house, and they dug into the hillside, dug out this bit, threw it over there, so that you get it vaguely level. The thatch is reed, but now, of course, the houses have been demolished. It had 2 rooms on the ground floor with a loft over the inner room. And it was divided, you can see here, divided by an elm partition, but that has now been taken away. And the position of the stairs to the loft has now changed. The roof is supported by 2 rough trusses. Now, there were other upland parishes further east, and they had slightly different houses. This house at Clywyd in Gethlegire, and again, these were up in the Welsh uplands, and the Anglo-Norman lords really rather left the Welsh up in the uplands, because if you've ever been to the Brecon Beacons, it's not the best agricultural land. But this house was assessed to John Jacob for 1 hearth, and it was a small type B house with this byre attached, and they had to enter through the byre and then up the stairs. I've got a plan to show you later on. The next house is a plan, I hope. Yes, you can see that they went in, and then, of course, something which also is seen in Wales, they made stone stairs round the fireplace. So you had the hall, and then the 2 rooms there, and then 2 cow houses. This is an extension. But as you can see above, there's this most delightful pigsty, again, made of stone, and it leans against the stone wall. Now, the present family who lived here have done a lot of work on the house, and they published it in the Gethlegire Historical Society. And somebody went back as far as when the tithes were stopped, when they were converted into money. And of course, up in the uplands, you had people who were chapel, and they didn't want to pay the vicar the tithes. And there's a big case about it. And in fact, the examination shows that in fact they paid the tithes in form of the corn, wool, lamb, cars, cheese, and honey. So although a one half house, he wasn't doing too badly. Now we'll go down to the coast to Bathor, and this is again a 3-unit type B house, as you can see from the plan, and 1 chimney, 2 chimneys, 3 chimneys, and they had 2 circular staircases, which you can see at the bottom. Now, I put this example in because sometimes when you're trying to identify a house in the hearth tax, you can't find it. And it's because sometimes, because the tax list is done according to parish, there can be centres of population in 2 different parishes. Now, Bathor was a little port, and in fact, the development was either side of the River Thor. Now, East Bathor is in 1 parish and 100, and West Bathor is in another parish and another 100. So unless you know where you are and where the dwellings fit into the tax list, you can get very confused. Now, the interesting thing that in the 17th century, a yeoman farmer acquired this house called Jenkins Spencer. He died in 1647 with 62 acres of farmland. I think he's the one for Thomas Spencer, 3 hearths in Penmark. And his inventory showed his goods to be worth £381. About 1/3 of this was wheat, 1/3 was in shares or boats or barks, and about 14% was in debts, itemised to 2 wealthy people, one of whom inhabited the largest house in the county. So this was in fact part of the smuggling and the piracy that went on. Nash Point, just near Bathor, is the most southern rocky point of the coast. And of course, they were on the through route to Bristol, so they were quite good at doing that. Now we go on to a house where we, again, another three-horse house where we know who he lived, because he was Whitgift Gibbon, the vicar. Now, it looks a very humble house, perhaps, for a vicar. Late 15th, early 16th century. Chimney backing on the entry. It was down there, the original entry. Now, you can see here 3 chimneys. Well, this was also a newer building. And when I first looked at this, I thought, well, are they the 3 chimneys? But in fact, more research shows that this outside chimney is is a later addition. And Whitgift used to live on the top floor with that chimney. That was the kitchen chimney. And the other chimney, the other bake, was in a bakehouse in a completely separate building. And whether because he was the vicar, he did the baking for the whole village. If you did your own baking and you had an oven in your hearth, then you didn't pay extra for that. But if you had an oven which was attached to a separate hearth in another building, then you did have to pay for it. Unfortunately, no will, and he died in 1671, just after the tax list. And at that stage, somebody in the parish was lending him money, so he wasn't very well off. But nice bit of stone archways here. There's quite a lot of stone in Glamorgan, even on fairly humble houses. If we now go up a bit to houses with greater number of hearths, where you can probably, because the people have community links, you can trace them. Now this guy, Mr. David Bennett, had 8 hearths, nice house, a farm, nice stonework over the front door, and you went into through there, and there was the staircase. Covered up windows for the window tax, but nice hoods on them. And somebody at some stage had decided that they wanted a hearth on the top floor, so they had to widen the chimney, and this is rather nice corbelling that they put on the bottom of the chimney. He, in fact, was steward to Sir Edward Mansell, who bought the dissolved Margam Abbey, assessed for 32 hearths. So he, as a steward, he knew what was going on. He knew where the new styles were. Of course, this bit of the house was added later. Now, another house of somebody who was quite well known, rather sad really, Blind Baglan, assessed to Mr. George Williams and for Mary Jones. Now, whether Mary Jones lived in the building or not, I don't know. But he was also a steward for the Earl of Pembroke for his manors round Neath. So he again knew what was going on. On the whole, the people who lived here, there was one guy, George Williams, who lived here from 1658 to 82. But by a judicious marriage, they'd found a nicer house in Kent. So it didn't stay very long in the family. It's got 2 stories and it's aligned across the slope. And you'll see that there was a shield there where obviously they had their arms, nice bit of stonework over the door. Now the next one will show you the plan of the house, and the cross hatching was the original house here. And then they built this bit on in about 1700. And then there was a whole lot of modern stuff afterwards. People have tried very hard to keep the house, but they haven't been terribly successful. But again, I'm going to show you another lovely chimney there, another lovely stepped chimney. And when we went there to draw the house, the slates had just been stolen the night before. Now, maybe houses in villages are easier to link to the hearth tax. So I think one has to look at something in Swansea. I've chosen Swansea because I think, well, neither Cardiff nor Swansea have that much left. But we'll see how we can match any sort of entries when very little survives. Now, again, we have to resort to paintings, and this was 1836. The castle in the background made it look rather smart because, in fact, it had been damaged in the Civil War. One of the Herberts had built a house in the castle grounds, and that by 1836 was in ruins. But you must look in the front here to this little place here where she's got all her washing on the line. And there must be an awful lot of houses. When you get a stone-built buildings, a lot of people who were not chargeable in the tax must have just coochied up against the stone wall with any sort of roof timbers that they could get. Quite big. Coal was being exported from Swansea, and of course great quantities of limestone. But they also exported grain, cattle and sheep, and they started to melt copper, which they all came in from Cornwall and Devon. The local borough records show that the merchant houses had courtyards that backed onto sites near the market. The inhabitants owned pigs and hens and some grain because winnowing was prohibited in the streets. Now, if we move on to one of Samuelnathan Buck's prints, you get a better idea of the houses. All sorts, some are quite little, one story there with windows at the top, and then you get one over here with about, well, that's 4 stories, and they probably would have had a cellar as well. You can't, when you read the inventories, it's interesting, and you read a lot of the inventories, a lot of them here, and when you can link the people with the hearth tax entries, there's a language very much in the inventories of upper lofts, divided houses, with both parties allowed free use of the grand stairs, division of the backside, with a free use of the lead pump in the garden, or they might say 2 little houses in the garden, or a new room in the backside. Now, the backside was a term they used either for the back of the building or within the curtilage of the property. But oh, to know the difference between a mansion house, a dwelling, and a little house. Now, Jeremiah Spence, who was a mariner, was assessed for 5 hearths in the Strand. He lived with 7 rooms, 2 of which were described as a shop and chamber over the shop. He had 2 large pigs and 4 small ones. We have no detail of the building except that he lived in the pinion end of a house in the Strand. Now, when we go on to a particular house, again, we have to rely on a painting, but there's a date stone there of 1620. Clearly, the dormer window is a later addition, and these were what the shops were like. I looked at Roger Leach's shops in Bristol, and oh no, we weren't quite like that in Wales. You know, you had a front door, and you opened it and you put your goods outside. Again, you've got a different house here that was built probably much later. Now, what do you do with entries in a tax list when you haven't got the chargeable? We haven't got, I know we haven't got all the chargeable, but you can play around with the, you haven't got the not chargeable, but you can play around with the chargeable. Now, I did this in Swansea, where the names are all listed according to street. And there is a hierarchy, with 50% of the entries of 3+ being in the 2 streets, which formed a direct route between the ferry and the market. And the area with the lowest proportion of 3 hearths occurred in the Liberty and the Strand. Now, the Liberty was a rural area where the burgesses had rights to wood and pasture. And the inventories of this area reflect a much more rural living, no cellars for storage, and a higher proportion of wealth in oxen, sheep, and pigs. Of course, what a lot of the burgesses did was to buy up the land outside the town and pasture cattle on it, and then they would lease the cattle out to the people who couldn't afford to have them themselves. And the Strand, as I say, was basically the riverside with storehouses, shipbuilding, and repair. Now, we have to end with the highest hearth in the hearth tax list, not like these. Burton Agnes, you said, had 40 something. Well, this is going to be the biggest hearth, recorded as 48. This was Squire Thomas of Rupert, as it was pronounced then. And it's on almost on the border of Glamorgan and Monmouthshire. And it's really built in 1626. Very different from a lot of the other houses that were built, the bigger houses that were built when the gentry started building their houses in about 1600, 1650. This one, he entertained the Duke of Beaufort, who owned a lot of land, in 1684. And he put up a park for him. And of course, they also had gatehouses. So you never quite know. In fact, some of the Welsh ones at Glamorgan Abbey, they do distinguish between the hearths and the gatehouse and the hearths and the main house. And as Catherine said, you know, sometimes you can do this, sometimes you can't. The reason why Edmund Thomas owned about 90 hearths in the whole of the county. And this was because Edmund Thomas, his children and grandchildren died young, and the property went to his sister, who married Edmund Thomas. Now, I have got a plan of this Renaissance house. And you can see this is on the first floor. Originally, it had gables like that. But then in the previous picture, they'd had a fire in the 1700s, so it was all castellated. And then, of course, the army took it over in the war, and they had another fire. So there's not much left of it now. I think, as I say, 2 points I'd like to make. One is that the architectural period from 1530 to 1650 was when a lot of people rebuilt their homes and showed their status because, you know, they were empowered now that they joined with England. Now, from 1650 to 1750 was rather a fallow time because there were few new families and a dearth of male heirs. So estates passed by marriage to people who already had houses elsewhere. So Glamorgan homes tended to be occupied by younger sons. And we mustn't forget that it's a long way from London where the action was until you get to the 19th and very beginning of, 1900, 1920, when Cardiff and Barry became the largest coal exporting port in the world. So this is very early days before the coal really took off. And with that, I'd like to say thank you very much.